First of all, thank you all for inviting me. I'm very sorry I can't be in Austria, but I'm very happy for this new technology that allows us to exchange ideas. So I'm going to talk about the current crisis, and one of the things I was really asked to do is to talk about what alternative macroeconomic policies we might adopt. What are alternatives to the ways that policymakers have been running their economies? So I'm going to begin by talking about the goals that we might aspire to. My own view as an economist, we can't begin to make macroeconomic policy unless we have agreement on what economic well-being would include. Once we have some social agreement, some widespread social agreement on what those goals are, we can begin to develop policies to achieve those goals. Now, I don't know about Austria, but I know that in the US, we don't very frequently have discussions about what national economic goals are. And I think that's a serious problem. But I'm going to suggest to you what I think are really 4 key macroeconomic goals. And so just to be clear, I should be on the first slide now. So the first goal, I think what is most fundamental, especially for adults who have children, is economic security. That requires several things. It requires a stable source of income. In other words, it requires that there be enough jobs and that unemployment be very low. It also requires that there be social protection. And that's because all of us in our lives, at some point in our life, are dependent on others, whether it's when we're children, when we're elderly, when we're sick or we're disabled. Social protection arrangements help to ensure our well-being during those periods of time. And finally, we need jobs that pay a living wage. So it's not just enough to have a job, but the jobs that we have to pay a wage that's high enough for us to lead a dignified life, even if not a wealthy life. So economic security is important. The second goal, I think, is fundamentally important in this world in which we've seen dramatic changes in gender relations, is that our policies need to ensure the well-being of single-parent households. We're at a moment of flux in our human history in terms of gender relations. And because of that, one of the dramatic changes and one of the problems we have to solve is the care of children. And so we need to ensure that we have policies that provide for that, and especially provide income support to single parents. Third, I think that there is broad agreement, almost even in the United States, on the fact that we need sustainable growth, and that means green growth. Therefore, our growth cannot be based on polluting kinds of production methods or simply mindless expansion of the production of goods and services. We need to rethink how we expand living standards. And finally, I would argue that one of the goals of macroeconomic policy has to be broadly shared well-being. That means, in other words, that insofar as there are rising living standards, it has to benefit the broad majority of society, not just limited numbers of groups. One of the reasons this is important, and I think Europeans understand this much more than Americans, is that inequality undermines social cohesion and leads to social conflict. And it's not an issue that has really been discussed much against macroeconomists, but I hope that it is increasingly getting attention. So could I have the next slide? So I'm looking at the audience now. I just want to ask you, am I talking too fast?
Perhaps a tiny bit, but it's very good.
Okay, I'll slow down. Okay. So I want to, discuss with you then, how are we doing in meeting those 4 goals that I just identified? That is living standards, economic security, and so forth. So I'm going to give you just a brief summary of what I see as the trends of the last 20 years, really. One of those trends is that growth rates have slowed down since the 1980s. So that means the rate of increase of gross domestic product is increasing at a slower rate than before the 1980s. That may not be terribly worrisome for the rich countries, right? But the second characteristic of the recent period is much more worrisome, and that is the dramatic increase in inequality, both within countries as well as between countries. I'm going to show you some data on that in a moment, but let me talk about the third trend, and that is the rise of atypical employment. So by that I mean employment that is insecure, that is temporary, that doesn't provide benefits, and doesn't provide income stability. We have especially seen a slowdown in the growth of jobs in high-income occupations and sectors. And what we're witnessing is more and more jobs that have low earnings. So, for example, in the US, those would be jobs in the service sector, working in the restaurant industry, or working as retail sales clerks. Those are the jobs that are growing the most rapidly, and they pay the least, and they have the least stability. And we can look at, these are money measures of well-being, but we could look at real quality of life indicators. So, for example, we might want to look at life expectancy, which would presumably be something we would all value, and we would hope that our economic policies would provide for the conditions that we were able to live longer and healthier lives. So could you turn to the next slide? So these are some data on the rate of annual increase in life expectancy. And what I've done is I've divided this into two time periods. The period 1960 to 1980, so before this period of globalization, and the period 1980 to 2006. And I've divided this also into income groups, countries according to their level of income. So the first is world income, and then you see HIPC, H-I-P-C, which means highly indebted poor countries, low-income countries, middle income such as South Korea, Taiwan, Brazil, and finally the high-income countries like the European countries and the United States. So the top bar for each of those countries shows the rate of increase, the annual rate of increase of life expectancy in the period 1960 to 1980. And the bottom bar shows the rate of increase from 1980 to 2006. So what you see is that although life expectancy is continuing to rise, it's rising at a much slower rate in this period of globalization. Now, this doesn't tell you exactly why and what the processes of globalization are that are causing this inequality, but certainly one factor is the growth of inequality. Could I have the next slide, please? We also are seeing, as I mentioned, the growth of inequality in terms of income. So if you look at the top graph, this is the ratio of income of the 20% richest households in the world divided by the ratio of income of the bottom of the poorest 20% of households in the world. And this is from 1820 to 2005. What you see here is starting in 1960, there's really a rapid growth of inequality, and it really accelerates after 1981. So that in 1980, the ratio of income, the wealthiest 20% of households earned roughly 30 times as much as the poorest. That ratio is now 105 times greater than the poorest households. The data on the bottom are for the United States. This is my point. The point I want to make is that we're seeing growing inequality between countries, which the top graph shows, but even within countries. And here for the United States, we're seeing a dramatic increase in income inequality. So, for example, now I need my glasses, just one moment. Once again, this looks at the ratio of income of the top 20% of households to the bottom 20% in the United States. And in 1979, that ratio was 11.4 to 1. So rich households earn roughly 11 times as much as poor households. By just something like 25 years later, that was almost 21 times greater than the poorest households. And in fact, most studies show that economic growth over the last 20 years has primarily gone to the 1% richest households. I think that, many of us would agree that economic growth that is shared by such a small percentage of the population is not healthy, and it's not the kind of economic growth that we want to achieve. Could I have the next slide? So one of the reasons, of course, that we're seeing this challenge in terms of inequality is that the wages of workers are not rising as fast as their productivity. And so when that happens, what that means is that it's lowering the share of national income that goes to workers, or what economists call the labor share of income. This graph that you see here looks at the EU countries, the United States, and Japan. And what you see here is that the wage share of national income, which was relatively high for Japan, around 75%, 77% in 1975, has fallen steadily since that period of time. So this phenomenon that I'm describing to you is broadly experienced across countries. Whether it's a rich country or poor country, we're seeing increasing earnings inequality. And I would argue to you that is one of the factors that is explaining our poor progress on, for example, life expectancy and other well-being indicators. Just as a comment, the wage share of income in the richest European Union countries has fallen 13% over the last 30 years. And one of the reasons this is problematic is that with globalization, corporations are able to move around the globe more easily and to negotiate for lower taxes. So what has occurred in this period of time is that the tax burden has shifted more to workers at the same time that their wages are falling, both absolutely and relatively. And it explains what economists call the fiscal squeeze, meaning the pressure on the public sector budgets. That is that there is too little funding for the social and economic projects. Raising taxes is challenging because you would be raising taxes on workers whose incomes are already falling. So could I have the next slide, please? So I want to talk in more detail because I actually, I think that inequality is the single most problematic economic issue facing us today. I would have to add to that climate change also, but at least in the social dimension, I would say that it is inequality. And I want to just discuss with you some of the features of globalization that are contributing to this problem of inequality. And the reason I do this is because if you want to solve the problem, you have to understand what the root cause is. And so that you can have specific policies that identify the problem and redress the problem. One of the features of globalization is what we call investment liberalization. That is the freedom of corporations to move across borders, to relocate from Austria to Poland to Cambodia, and so on and so forth. Now, this may be a good thing. It may or may not, but here's one of the problems it creates. It reduces worker bargaining power. So when workers are negotiating with an employer that is a multinational corporation, and the workers say, our productivity rose last year, we would like an equivalent increase in wages. The corporation has the ability to say no. And if you don't accept the no, we will relocate to another country. In fact, 5 years ago in the Wall Street Journal, there was a news article about Volkswagen. You all know Volkswagen. They had a factory in Spain. They told their workers that they wanted to cut wages. And the workers said, of course, no. And Volkswagen response was, if you don't accept this wage cut, we will close this factory and we will move to Poland. And of course, the workers accepted the wage cut. So my point is that there has been a shift in power, in bargaining power between corporations and between workers, so that it's much more difficult now for workers to raise their wages as their productivity rises. And in fact, in many countries, as I was just showing you with the graph, we've seen worker productivity rising much faster than their wages. So this ability of corporations to move is a factor that explains why wages can't keep up with productivity. Another phenomenon that is leading to growing inequality is financial deregulation. And just as corporations can move across the globe looking for the cheapest place to invest to make the highest rate of profits, wealth holders can now move money from one country to the next in order to find the highest rate of return on financial assets. Now, this is not in and of itself a bad thing, but it creates two serious problems. One serious problem it creates is the following. Financial markets, and wealth holders in particular, do not like inflation. So if I was there with you now, I would engage with you and ask you to tell me why they don't like inflation. But I'm not, so I'll just explain it to you. And that is because inflation erodes the rate of return on your investment. So if your rate of return is 10%, but inflation is 5%, then your real rate of return on your investment is only 5%. That means that wealth holders do not like to invest in countries that have high rates of inflation. They also don't like to invest in countries in which governments have budget deficits, because financial markets believe that budget deficits are inflationary. So the pressure on budgets and government spending also reduces spending on social protection and social programs that can also lead to inequality. And finally, one of the things that I know has been a very serious problem in Europe, as it has been for some time in the United States, and that is what is called the flexibilization of labor markets. That is, jobs are no longer so secure. Rather than being hired for a full year, you might be hired on a part-time basis or a contingent basis and so forth. And that work insecurity also adds to inequality. So could I have the next slide? I'm going to just say a couple of things because I realize that I don't want to run out of time and I want to say a few more things. So in Europe in particular, we are seeing a lot of evidence of the growth of the precariat, or what is sometimes called just-in-time workers. The problem with this, of course, is that there's limited access to social benefits. There's unpredictability. So as I was describing to you, single parents who are trying to manage childcare along with work that has atypical schedules, it's a very, very severe pressure on the home life of families. And of course, compensation tends to be very limited. Now, here's the other part of this, economically, that's very difficult. If employers are hiring workers into these precarious types of jobs as a way to save money, one of the things that means is that they have very little incentive to invest in training those workers. Why? Because you're not going to keep those workers. They're only going to be working for you for a while. In older times, that all of you could probably remember, of course, when you got a job, you anticipated being there for 10 or 20, even 30 years. So if your employer trained you, they knew that they could recoup or get back their investment in you because you would continue to work for them. But if you're only being hired part-time, employers have no incentive to invest in worker training. And that is bad, especially for workers, but it's bad for economies as a whole. Could I have the next slide, please? So I want to just talk about this current crisis, and that is, at least in the United States, one of the precipitating factors in the crisis is the low wages that emerged from the process of globalization. For many households, they had to borrow in order to maintain their standard of living. They had to borrow to cover medical costs. They had to borrow to cover costs of college, to cover the cost of prescription drugs, and so on and so forth. And so with the housing boom, many households refinanced their homes using that money from the refinancing to basically maintain the same standard of living. So in other words, it wasn't people who were being excessive, who were over-consuming. For many households, it was simply that people were trying to stay at the same level, standard of living. If I could have the next slide. And so what happened is, of course, is that the banks lent to these families. And in fact, the truth is that the crisis would have come much sooner had banks not been lending to households, especially through the housing boom. And I think what this demonstrates is the following, that we should not be distracted by the housing crisis. This fundamental problem is that an economy that sees the growth of inequality is on an unsustainable path. And it's on an unsustainable path because basically it means that there isn't enough demand to buy back all of the goods that are produced. So could I have the next slide, please? And economists have a saying, and I don't know how well it will translate, but the saying is the following. There are no sellers if there are no buyers. So that means that businesses are not going to hire workers and train them and pay them good wages if there's nobody to buy the goods and services that they produce. So the growth of inequality has depressed the income of a large segment of populations, and there's therefore too little buying of goods and services, and therefore what we have seen is a stagnation in economic growth and the problems that we have observed as a result of that. Could I have the next slide? So what this has led to is, this may be more information than you want, but I'll just say this briefly, is a process of what economists are now calling financialization. So financialization is the growth of the financial sector of the economy relative to the rest of the economy. And it's easier to tell it to you as a story. And so here it is in sort of story form. That corporations in the 1980s and 1990s were experiencing very little demand for their goods and services. Economic growth was relatively slow compared to the past. And so it meant that their profits were lower than in the past. And so instead of, when firms did make profits, they tried to lower wages, they outsourced to developing countries, but when they made profits, they saw no reason to invest those profits back into the firm in the form of research and development, building new factories, hiring more workers to increase output. Instead, what they did was they took many of those profits and they bought financial instruments in the financial sector. So all of that money went into the financial sector instead of producing real goods and services. And the financial sector then lent the money to the poor households who were suffering from wages that were too low. So you can see that there's a circuit going on here that resulted from the growth of inequality. So if I could have the next slide, please. So of course, what we observed is the global economic crisis, and I don't know to what extent it's covered in Austrian newspapers. Economists predict that we will not return to pre-crisis economic conditions, that is, the levels of unemployment that existed in 2008, until at least 2017, and some new estimates are saying 2019. So this economic crisis is very long, and it is very, very, very severe. And what we are observing is of course, pressure on government budgets, because with slow growth, with high unemployment, it means that there are too few tax revenues to support the budgets that we have had, and governments are under pressure to cut their budgets. And so we're seeing many governments adopting austerity packages. Greece is not the only one. Greece is the most severe that I have seen, but this is happening in the United States. This is happening globally, except perhaps for China. And so there are very severe problems and long-lasting problems that come from a prolonged crisis. One of those problems, this is especially true in developing countries, is that it increases women's care burden. Many of the public services that are being cut are typically the types of jobs that we associate with women and women's care work, if you will. And so we see cuts to child care subsidies. We see a reduction in services for the disabled or the elderly. And so in the absence of those services, it is women within the household who replace the lost public sector cuts. So for example, when home health care aides are cut, it means that family members, and usually women, have to provide that time. It also means when family income falls, that many goods that were purchased in the market are now purchased at home. So families spend less in restaurants and cook more meals at home. But because there's a gender division of labor, it typically means that women's leisure time increases and that they face significant time pressures. Again, I simply point to the fact that these problems are significantly greater for single-parent families. So could I have the next slide, please? I'm going to ask you to skip that slide and just go on to the next one, which is a quote. So I'll let you, this is a quote by Joseph Stiglitz. Joseph Stiglitz, if you do not know him, is a Nobel Prize winner in economics. He's one of the foremost economists in the world. And he made this comment recently, which he says, we have huge unmet needs in climate change, in poverty, in an economic system in which there is huge economic capacity and huge unmet needs. If you can't solve those problems, that economic system is not functioning the way that it should. And what I have just described to you is an economy that fits that description. There's great potential, there's great productive potential, and yet there are many unmet needs for the reasons, hopefully, that I have articulated to you. So if I could have the next slide, please. So I want to suggest to you what an alternative would be to a model to what I call hyper-globalization. That is an excessive focus on liberalizing markets at a cost of human well-being and human development. So I'm going to just list for you some of the things that we might do in order to achieve these goals and what our governments might focus on. The first is that to boost economic growth by raising domestic demand. So there are many ways that governments can do this. Most significantly, this happens through government spending, either through investment in infrastructure, in education, healthcare, variety of areas that increase productivity, but also creates jobs. And so one of the things that governments then can think about doing is to enact stimulus packages or increase public expenditures targeted towards these strategic sectors of the economy and that increase human capital. Now, if you were here in the U.S., what you might hear as a response to that is that that the government is already in debt, and we cannot afford to do that. And in fact, we're doing the opposite. We're cutting budget deficits. But here's my response to you, that these kinds of expenditures are similar to any other kind of investment. They raise productivity. They therefore are likely to raise the incomes of people who receive these investments. Those higher incomes will yield tax revenues that will help to pay the cost of the initial investment. And so we really have to think of these expenditures not as social spending per se, but as public investment in physical infrastructure and in human infrastructure. If I could have the next slide, please. Just very quickly, another thing that we have to do in addition to government spending to stimulate the economy is to correct and rebalance the distortion of bargaining power between workers and corporations so that workers are able to benefit with higher wages as their productivity rises. And if I could have the next slide, please. And that's not easy to do. Every country will find a different way to do it. And it depends on the institutions, depends on a variety of factors. But I just suggest here some examples, such as in certain cases in promoting worker-owned cooperatives. It would require a rethinking of the way bank lending occurs. Specific banks would need to be entrusted with the goal of lending to this kind of organization. It would require, one thing we might do is require corporations to report on the conditions under which goods are produced. So for example, recently there's been a discussion about conflict diamonds. Corporations, including Apple Computer, which uses inputs that are purchased under very unequal conditions. And whether that be child labor or sweatshops and so forth. So one way to sort of rebalance bargaining power is to act in ways to require corporations to behave ethically in terms of their relationship with the people that work for them or whom they buy their goods and inputs from. If I could have the next slide. I actually have more to say, and I don't want to go too fast. So I'm just going to be very brief because I'd like to leave time for you all to ask questions and so forth. And so I'm actually going to ask to slip to the next slide that says, third, re-regulate the financial sector. So one of the biggest problems that we have is the movement of money across borders that has destabilized governments. It has led to over 100 banking crises in the last 30 years since 1980. And one of the proposals has been what is called a Tobin tax. It is a tax on money that crosses borders, or a tax on exchange rate purchases. So for example, if you're going to buy dollars with euros, that transaction might be taxed. Most of these taxes are very low. They're 0.25%. They penalize speculation, but they don't discourage productive investment. So they stabilize the economy. They reduce the risk of crisis. They support incentives for productive investment. The best thing about them is it's a tax you could avoid. If you don't engage in this behavior, you don't have to pay the tax. But finally, estimates are that this kind of tax could generate something like $300 billion annually globally, which could be used as a social insurance fund to fund social protection in the event of crises, for example. And finally, if I could have the next to the last slide, it's fourth, government should promote gender equality. So I think, one of the things that economists have found in recent years is that countries with greater degrees of gender equality have better outcomes in terms of economy-wide well-being, whether that is economic growth, whether it is life expectancy, a variety of social indicators. And so I want to submit to you that we should begin to think about integrating that into macroeconomic policies, including policies that make it possible to combine work and family. One of the most important reasons we have gender inequality is that women do most of the unpaid care work, and they therefore have less time to spend in the paid economy. Policies that make it easier to combine both of those roles and easier for men to share in those roles will go a long ways to producing gender inequality. And finally, if I could just go to the last slide, I want to just say that, that in my own view, that a general principle should be the following, that we should ask ourselves when our governments are making macroeconomic policy, we should ask ourselves and we should ask our representatives, are these policies that ultimately serve the needs of ordinary people who are working hard to provide for themselves and their families? And if not, then we need to devise policies that achieve that goal. Thank you.